few minutes about the APS. I have a clicker. I have a clicker. Good. Welcome. My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the librarian and director of the Library and Museum here at the American Philosophical Society. And before we get started, let me begin this evening's program as we do by recognizing where we are. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. So, before I get started, I'm gonna say this, I'm gonna ask this question at every public event I introduce, and one of these days, everyone's gonna raise their hand, and I'm not gonna know what to do. But how many of you have been to the APS before? Okay, almost all of you. How many of you have not been to the APS before? Okay, excellent. You folks, I'm speaking to you. For the others, it's a refresher. So the American Philosophical Society was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin and many others to be an analog to the Royal Society of London. And one of the things I love, I've given you a brief picture of one of the founding document, the initial charter, is that their optimism at this moment in time. So this again is written in 1743, and it starts with the first drudgery of settling the colonies, which confines the attention of people to mere necessaries, is now pretty well over. Yeah, I know, Benjamin Franklin was a very smart man, but in this particular instance, I think he may have gotten it wrong. Nonetheless, it became a place where people came together, and they chose Philadelphia for a number of reasons, but largely because we were the epicenter, literally geographically the center of the 13 colonies. So this was a place where people, thinkers, scientists, philosophers, economists, chemists, people interested in climate, animals, plants, could come together and share their knowledge. And they did. And they continue to do so. The American Philosophical Society, here, oh, this is a fun one. How many of you think that the American Philosophical Society is, and see, this is not fair because people will be like, no, I'm not going to raise my hand. There's a trick answer in there. I know there is. There might be. How many of you think of the American Philosophical Society primarily as an early American archive? Okay. How many of you think of it primarily as a place that studies the history of science? Oh my God, my curator of the history of science is like, that's me, that's me. That's right. How many of you are familiar with our work with Native American and indigenous cultures? Wow, that's impressive. How many of you realize we're a membership organization? Wow, okay, all right, fair enough, right, because you're here. So there are a number of ways in which the APS continues its mission. One is that we do, in fact, have a membership, actually a couple of different kinds. There is the elected membership, people who are elected to the APS because of their academic contributions, about 1,000 of those. Maybe 4/5 of these live in the US and the others are abroad. And then we have meetings. We have 2 annual conferences where we bring these members to Philadelphia. We also have library and museum conferences and public programs like this, which is a monthly event in addition to our lunchtime monthly events, and usually about 3 academic conferences a year. We do have a press. It is the longest running continuously publishing press in North America, the APS Press, and they have recently been relaunched. They're publishing books and have 2 wonderful peer-reviewed journals, and then we have research. And how many people have received a grant or a fellowship from the APS here? Excellent. You can raise your hand high. Look at me, he's like, I did. No, that's proud of it. That is something that we are very proud of. We have both fellowships that bring you to the APS, and we have fellowships that send people around the world. Collections, very briefly. We have 14. This is going to become a call and response. Again, the more you come to my introductions, the more I'm going to say, how many manuscript pages? And you'll say, right. I'm not going to make you do it tonight. That was my staff, and they're just doing it to humor me. But we do have 14 million manuscript pages. We have over 325,000 books. We have the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, and I believe at least one other on promise, multiple digital objects and born digital objects, which is going to be the wave of archives in the future, as well as a wonderful museum. And let me pause and say that how many of you have been to the APS Museum? You didn't realize there was going to be a test tonight. How many of you have been to the APS Museum? Good. On April 11th, our new exhibition is opening. It's called Philadelphia, a Revolutionary City, and it is wonderful. For those of you who have not come, the museum is open free of charge Thursdays through Sundays, mid-April through the end of December. So I encourage you to come. I've already mentioned our 4 centers: Native American and Indigenous history, digital scholarship, early American history, specifically the American Revolution, and the history of science is where we both focus our collections and focus our research fellowships. And you might be asking how we do all of these things. And the answer is we do it with people like you. So this is the Friends Evening Lecture Program. You should have, if you haven't already, picked up a brochure about the Friends program and how you can support this work, as well as at the front table, a wonderful list of programs that will be happening throughout the spring term. If you have any questions about the APS, about our programming, or about the Friends program, please feel free to ask any member of staff. And let me go ahead and embarrass them by asking them to raise their hands. Thank you. Okay, yeah, and emeritus staff. Thank you, Bob. Thank you. All right, that being done, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's program. Tonight we are looking at Amy Jane Cohen's Black Philadelphia in the Philadelphia Landscape, which recounts notable aspects of the Black experience from the late 1600s to the 1960s and how this history is marked in the contemporary city. It is no understatement to say that Black Philadelphians have contributed to the city's history since there was a city. And Cohen's approach to this material evinces the stability of these contributions over time. Each chapter, she focuses on a different individual or a different historical figure or a different event that made an impact on the environment, the Philadelphia city environment. Some names will be familiar: Charles Blockson, Richard Allen, W.E.B. Du Bois, people whose history you think you know, but who I think you might get to know better this evening, and others may be new to you. All of these individuals and more become the vehicle for understanding our city's development. And while the chapters are organized chronologically, they give, I think, a very strong narrative arc from the 17th century to the 20th century. Amy Cohen is an educator, a historian, and a writer. After 2 decades of teaching social studies, she became the Director of Education for History Making Productions and is a contributing writer for Hidden City, Philadelphia. Please join me in welcoming Amy to the podium.
Thank you for that introduction, and good evening. I always start with the elephant in the room. What is a Jewish woman such as myself doing writing a book on Black history? And to answer that question, I have to go back about 20 years. As Michelle said, I was a teacher, a social studies teacher. And in 2005, I was teaching at Masterman School, and a mandate came down from the school district saying that every high school student in the city, in the public schools, needed to take a year of African American history. And no one in my department had ever taught African American history. There were no African American members of the department, which is pretty common across the city and the country. And I had been teaching briefly an elective about the history of Philadelphia. So you can't learn Philadelphia history without learning at least something about the Black experience in the city And so with that like little modicum of knowledge, I raised my hand and said, okay, I'll teach the new course. And so right from the start, local history was a focus of the course. And then when I left the classroom in 2013, I went to work for History Making Productions. Some people know it as Sam Katz's documentary company. We made documentaries about the history of Philadelphia, often with African American history content. I was director of education, which meant I developed curriculum to go along with the films, and often I would develop the curriculum centered on whatever the Black story was in the given film. And then after I'd been there for a while, I also had the opportunity to produce some films, Cecil's People and Octavius Catto. So I stayed in this world of local Black history. And I also started writing monthly for Hidden City. You're probably familiar with it, but it's about the built environment of Philadelphia, and many, not all, but many of the stories that I wrote were again about local Black history. So having been in this Black history realm for almost 20 years, one thing that I knew was that there wasn't a single one-volume accessible book that a person could go and purchase and get an overall general sense of the Black experience in Philadelphia. And so, despite not being a Black person, I channeled the words of the late, great Toni Morrison. If there is a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And so I did. I approached Temple Press and was given a contract and wrote the book. Now, why did I focus on history in the landscape and not just the history itself? Well, for that, I also have to go back to when I was teaching. Because I think that things that are in our landscape are really a conversation between generations, and it makes the connection between past and present. Quick, easy example, in an African American history course, you learn about Thomas Jefferson. Yes, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, but you also learn he was an enslaver on a massive scale. You learn that he wrote scathing, horrendous things about Black people as a race in Notes on the State of Virginia. And you learn, of course, that he had several children by the enslaved and 30 years his junior, Sally Hemings. So he doesn't come out looking like quite the founding father on a pedestal. And so then I would show my students a picture like this, the Jefferson Memorial. Prominent place on the National Mall. Should anything be changed? Should anything be qualified? Should there be some kind of signposting? Just throw it out there to the students, and their opinions would range from don't touch it, it's a sacred national monument, to throw the whole thing in the Potomac. And I often use these examples, so that was why I chose that as the lens through which to tell the Black history story in Philadelphia. Like Michelle, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. And the first is, which individual historic figures are most frequently represented in American monuments? And just some names that come to mind. Okay. Okay. Now, I should have moved ahead more quickly because you guys are too smart. Number 6 is Robert E. Lee. I'm going to give you the top 6. Grant is not in the top 6, so just think about that for a moment. Would any other country have this situation? I think not. Number 5, even you smarties didn't get, but no one ever does, St. Francis of Assisi. Number 4, Martin Luther King, which again is rarely guessed. Number 3, Christopher Columbus, which is a whole nother story, especially in a place where there's a big study of indigenous people, but we're not going to have to go there tonight. And as you probably surmise, number 2, George Washington, and number 1, Abraham Lincoln. And this, by the way, is the Abraham Lincoln statue that's on Kelly Drive across from Boathouse Row. It's actually one of the very early Lincoln statues. It dates to 1871. More questions for you. Hold up your fingers. Of the 50 most represented figures, how many do you think are people of color? And you know at least one already. Okay, I see 1, I see 2. Okay. The gentleman in the back, there are 5, and I will reveal who they are. How many are female? Okay, we have one right answer right there. There's actually 3. Okay, which most of you had up 1 or 2. And you were certainly on the right track because there are 11 times as many statues of mermaids as there are of female congresswomen. So, and then a much more serious question, and you don't need to put up fingers, even all your fingers and your toes wouldn't do it. How many were enslavers? Half, so 25 out of 50. How do I know this? It's because Monument Lab, a local organization based just a few blocks from here, but that has become nationally and even internationally known, did a huge audit that was published in 2021. So these numbers are fairly recent. My guess is that Robert E. Lee may have, since they did the audit, dropped from number 6, but doing this audit was a huge undertaking, and so these are the most recent numbers we have. In terms of the people of color, in addition to Dr. King, Tecumseh, Sacagawea, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman are on the top 50, and then the women, other than Sacagawea and Harriet Tubman, I'm surprised, can you, well, actually, you can probably see it here, but it's one that Philadelphians should be able to get, Joan of Arc. Yes, very. So once this big audit was done with a huge grant from the Ford Foundation, the Monument Lab came up with 4 main conclusions. 1, monuments have always changed. And within, I think, a week of the nation's founding, there was already a monument that was destroyed. What do you think it was? King George III, exactly, right here in Philadelphia. So monuments have always changed. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And then finally, the story of the United States, as told by our current monuments, misrepresents our history. Or, as New York Magazine put it at the time of the publication, the nation's monuments are male, pale, and stale. So that's kind of the national picture. I'm going to spend the rest of the evening focused on Philadelphia. So monuments about Black history in Philadelphia. Well, there's this monument that most of you have probably seen because it is prominently located between Loken Circle and the Franklin Institute. It's the All Wars Memorial to Colored Soldiers and Sailors. You may have gone by it and never realized that there were black soldiers and sailors standing next to that image of liberty, which is the biggest image and is a white woman. It's, certainly a dated statue, but the chapter in the book about this statue, about this monument, tells the story of how it was always intended when the idea was first formulated and approved by the Pennsylvania legislature. The idea was that it was going to be on the Parkway. But once the statue was done in the early 1930s, the art jury, the all-white art jury, said, no way is that going on the Parkway. There was a whole back and forth that lasted a few years, and eventually it was put in Fairmount Park, kind of in an obscure corner, and did not come to the Parkway until 1996, 60 years later. And then, of course, in more recent times, the Octavius Catto Memorial. This was at the unveiling. So when this statue was unveiled in September of 2017, it was the first statue of an individual black person on public land in the entire city, 2017. And if you've been there, which I hope many of you have, it's not just a statue, it's a whole memorial that tells the story of Octavius Catto, this remarkable 19th century scholar, educator, baseball player, Civil War recruiter, civil rights leader, who was killed on Election Day in 1871. So once the statue went up, that was, a huge moment, a huge accomplishment. But then since the time it's been there, it has really served as an important symbol. It has become the gathering place for all kinds of social justice demonstrations. This is a press conference of black male elected officials when they wanted to encourage black men to vote. Of course, they used Catto as the backdrop. And then showing that, actually, let me ask you a question before I get to the next slide. How many of you have heard of Octavius Catto? How many of you would have heard of Octavius Catto had there not been a statue at City Hall? Okay, a smaller number. Now, Octavius Catto, as I said, I made a film about him, and I wrote a curriculum about him many years ago when he was truly an obscure person in the city's consciousness. So I was truly stunned when earlier this year I saw in the Philadelphia Inquirer, yes, I get the hard copy, I'm old, that in their ad campaign, they used an image of Octavius Catto, which means that they had to think, well, most people in Philadelphia, at least people that get the paper, are going to understand what that means. And that really kind of overwhelmed me. The first time I saw that ad, I took a picture and immediately sent it to Dan Biddle and Mary Dubin, who some of you may know. They were the authors of a book called Tasting Freedom that was a biography of Catto and his times that came out in about 2010, I think. Okay, but that's it for monuments, the All Wars Memorial and Catto. So clearly there has to be more to monuments than those two, or it would be a very short book. So other than monuments, how do we honor historic people, events, and institutions in the landscape? Murals? Plaques? Yes. Public buildings. Street signs, street names. Okay, good job. All right, so I'm going to start with markers because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and they are the most ubiquitous. I've had a thing for markers, especially since when I was teaching that course on local Philadelphia history, my students applied for this marker about about an anti-Black riot that happened in 1842, and it was accepted and dedicated. And having gone through that with my students, it really made me realize that the history that we see around us, we can help shape that. That just normal citizens and even high school kids can help to shape the history that we tell ourselves and our visitors. But until the early 1990s, the only marker in the city that directly referenced Black history was this one that's very close. It's around the corner on 5th Street, just south of Walnut, the original site of St. Thomas African Episcopal Church. And that was there since the 80s, but other than that, no other markers about Black history. So Charles Blockson, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a scholar and collector of Black history, saw this absence and got some grant money from the William Penn Foundation and applied for dozens of historical markers. And most of those applications were accepted. If you look at many markers around the city that mark Black history sites and individuals and so forth, you'll see it'll say 1991 or 1992. It's a pretty safe guess that was one of Blockson's original markers. At this point, about a third of the markers in the city directly reference Black history. This marker was actually unveiled in 2016. That's Blockson himself, who has since passed away, doing the actual unveiling. And this was one about the Pennsylvania slave trade. And he did say of all the markers he was responsible for, this marker that's on the Delaware River is the one he was most proud of. I use this marker as an example partly to give you a sense of the bookends of the scope of the project. So I begin in the 1600s because the Black presence has been here that long. And then I go up to the 1960s, and someone said murals. Yes, Philadelphia truly is a city of murals. This mural is of Father Paul Washington, the leader of the Church of the Advocate, who was a supporter of the Black Power movement. And that's the other bookend of the book. So it goes 1600s to 1960s. Okay, someone else said names of public buildings. This is a school in South Philadelphia. It was called the Andrew Jackson School, and it's a very diverse school. And the school community kind of realized, well, maybe we don't want to be named for someone responsible for the displacement and slaughter of huge numbers of Native Americans, someone who was an enslaver, and so they went through a process and came up with the name Fanny Jackson Coppin. Coppin was, like Octavius Catto, a teacher and administrator at the Institute for Colored Youth. Street names is something else that someone mentioned. There's lots of these little honorary street names. This one, Richard Allen Lane, is very close to my home and therefore close to my heart. I did ask the streets department if they had a list of these honorary street names, because I was curious to see how many of them were for African Americans. Needless to say, they don't keep a list. But there are quite a few of these. But changing an entire street name, not just putting a red band up, is much more complicated undertaking and much less common. So it did happen in the 1980s when Columbia Avenue was renamed for Cecil B. Moore. And soon it will be happening for Taney Street. Taney Street, as you may know, is named for Roger B. Taney, the Supreme Court justice who wrote the Dred Scott decision, saying that no black person could ever be a citizen of the United States. He has no connection to Philadelphia. Even his direct descendants have said that they would like to see the name changed, and so activists along Taney Street, including children, got involved, and they chose the name Caroline LeCount, who was also an educator at the Institute of Colored Youth and then other places. She was Cato's fellow civil rights activist and his fiance. And finally, after many delays, City Council has approved this, so hopefully sometime in this calendar year, we'll have another major name change. And then, of course, historic sites like the Marian Anderson Historic Site, which was badly damaged by water several years ago, but it is reopening next month. And if you haven't been to that historic house museum, they need your support, and it's in South Philadelphia. So Monument Lab defines a monument as a statement of power and presence in public. So even though Philadelphia has a dearth of actual statues of Black people, we certainly have many markers of Black history that fit this definition. So I'm going to go through one example of a memorial that I talk about in my book, but in general, these are the ways that our landscape changes. Is that first we have to understand that, of course, history is not the past. It's an ongoing process of interpreting the past. The past does not change, but our understanding of it does, which is kind of saying the same thing in different words, but I think it's such an important point that I'm making it twice. Historical interpretations often reveal more about the times in which they are written than they do about past events. And then finally, as our historical interpretations evolve, our monuments reflect new understanding. Now, that's not automatic. As historical interpretations change, the monuments don't kind of magically change to go with it. It takes time, it takes political will, it takes organization, but eventually it happens. And in Philadelphia in the 21st century, it has happened a lot. And I'm going to, in a moment, read some excerpts from a chapter in my book that I think really shows how this process works and how it has worked in the 21st century. Because if you looked at the historical landscape in the year 2000 and compared it to our historical landscape today in Philadelphia, you would see a dramatic difference. So the example I'm going to read about is the President's House Memorial, just a few blocks from here. And of course, it's built on the site of what was the Robert Morris House or the President's House at 6th and Market, where both George Washington and then later John Adams spent some of their presidency. So I'm not reading the whole chapter, just some excerpts. So I will start here. When Washington left office in 1797, John Adams became the next resident of the President's House. Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, were the only two of the first 12 U.S. presidents who did not own enslaved people. Although the national capital was supposed to move to the banks of the Potomac, leaders in Pennsylvania tried mightily to keep the capital in Philadelphia. A mansion 3 times the size of the President's House was constructed on 9th Street as a luxurious abode for the nation's chief executive. Adams, however, could not be enticed to decamp to this grand residence, even when the city doubled the rent on the president's house to force the move. In December 1800, Adams became the first president to inhabit the White House in Washington, D.C. The Philadelphia President's House was initially sold and became a hotel. As the surrounding area became increasingly commercial, the once elegant dwelling was gutted and converted into 3 stores on the ground level with a boarding house on the floors above. Although the facade of the building was significantly altered, some of the original walls were still in place until 1951. And this is a 1949 photo. So this Washington Hall clothing store had some of the original walls. But in 1951, the entire structure, along with hundreds of other longstanding buildings, was demolished to make room for Independence Mall. So you can see Independence Mall up there. And then this is where the president's house would have been. Another site from a different angle. A public restroom, that's what you're seeing there, was built on the president's house site. A small plaque indicated that the toilet facility sat atop the former home of presidents. In late 2000, an archaeological dig on Independence Mall revealed that a proposed new home for the Liberty Bell, a symbol long associated with freedom, overlapped some of the outbuildings of the president's house. In January 2002, construction of the Liberty Bell Center was well underway when a bombshell revelation about the location of the new structure came out in the winter issue of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. An article by the independent historian Edward Lawler meticulously presented information about the architecture and appearance of the president's house. Among his findings, quote, "The last thing that a visitor will walk across or pass before entering the Liberty Bell Center will be the slave quarters that George Washington ordered added to the president's house." So when this article was published, it created quite a stir among historians and then among journalists, among members of the general public. The initial response of the Park Service is, well, you know, we've already had all our placards approved and everything, and we're just going to leave things as they are. And the activism kept up, and eventually they did agree to indicate at the entrance that it was next to the president's house, and that's where I'm going to pick up my reading. Once agreement between historians and the Independence National Historical Park leaders was reached regarding the Liberty Bell Center, attention turned to the president's house site. Grassroots activism by Black Philadelphians was central to this next phase. On July 3rd, 2002, hundreds of African Americans gathered at the Liberty Bell Center to demand a monument to Washington's slaves. The Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, led by the attorney Michael Cord, who you see there, organized a petition drive and a letter writing campaign with this same objective. And then eventually, they get some money, they get more historian support, and Chaka Fattah, a Black member of the U.S. Congress, spearheaded legislation to appropriate funds for the National Park Service to develop a plan to commemorate the president's house and its enslaved residents. Then I have a few paragraphs about the process of designing that and getting community feedback and so forth. And then finally, on a bitter cold December morning in 2010, the President's House, Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation, was dedicated. Emmanuel Kelly's innovative open-air monument broadly represents the structure and dimensions of the President's House. Historical reenactments are displayed on video monitors perched on brick walls above faux fireplaces. A granite wall lists the names of each person enslaved at the President's House. And initially, the reception of the monument by critics was not too friendly. I'll just read a few of those. Critics panned the new monument's form and content. Inga Saffron, writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer, called it a confused jumble of bricks. Edward Rothstein of the New York Times described it as lacking both intellectual coherence and emotional power. In the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, Stephen Kahn wrote of the video monitors mounted on chimney walls. Rather than evoke one of the grandest houses in 18th century Philadelphia, these make the place feel more like 21st century McMansions. But there also were mixed reviews, and I want to read you something that also Inga Saffron wrote about it. She said, as the first federal site to acknowledge the congenital defect of slavery, the project's very existence is special. It's not until you are inside the space that you understand the memorial as a full-throated expression of pain and rage. Sure, Washington's tenure there is virtually reduced to a footnote, but at least that story can be found in books. This is the rare memorial where history's collisions can be experienced firsthand. And I'll finish up with, love it or hate it, the President's House Memorial is a manifestation of a sea change in how Black history is represented in Philadelphia. In 2002, leaders of the National Park Service sought to maintain the fiction of heroic founding fathers creating a glorious nation characterized by liberty and justice for all. They eschewed input from academics and the general public. Over the course of less than a decade, however, the orientation of the Park Service changed dramatically. The history presented to locals and tourists at the President's House Memorial and elsewhere has become significantly more challenging, more complex, and more inclusive. Adjacent to the Liberty Bell Center, where officials once resisted, including information about slavery, sits an entire structure whose purpose is to make visitors contemplate the people whose bondage helped to build our country. And then what follows in this chapter is a reflection by Michael Cord about his feelings about the memorial, and about half the chapter have similar reflections, and then every chapter has a to-do list, kind of videos to watch or places to visit or primary sources to look up online to learn a little more about whatever the topic is. I'm just going to share with you one more quick example of a modification to the landscape before I take your comments and questions. And this one is about a much more contemporary aspect of history, the Girard College protests. As some of you may know and may even remember, in 1967, Cecil B. Moore led a protest around the walls of Girard College, a school that was for fatherless white boys, according to the will of Stephen Girard. There were court cases about it because in order to desegregate this school in the wake of Brown v. Board, Girard's will would have to be violated. And Cecil B. Moore, the leader of the Philadelphia branch of the NAACP, organized mostly young people in the Girard College neighborhood, what at that point was an almost entirely Black neighborhood. And for 7 months and 17 days, they marched around the walls of the college, and eventually that helped to put pressure on the school to desegregate. Now, those young people in the 1960s are now 70-somethings, many of them still around. And this mural that actually I used on the cover of my book is a dedication to those people, some of whom you can see here. And this photo was from the mural dedication in, I believe, 2021. And you can see there that the mural dedication took place, on North College Avenue. Let me just go back for a second. So North College Avenue. But if you go there now, there's one of these honorary street signs that says Freedom Fighters Way, because those young people who back in the day called themselves the Young Militants, today call themselves the Cecil B. Moore Philadelphia Freedom Fighters. And this honorary street name just happened in October. There was a lovely ceremony. There I am. And there's a lot more people than it looks like, because there's a whole lot of seats in front of where I'm standing. So there were, a couple hundred people on this beautiful October day. And the freedom fighters were just thrilled for this honor. That's City Councilman Jeffrey Young, who sponsored the legislation to get the honorary street name. But the idea of changing the street name came from third graders at the Germantown Friends School. And so these third graders, now they're big fourth graders, were also there with their teacher. And following the dedication, there was a sort of recreation of the March Around the Wall, that it was both the today's Girard College students, which are over 90% African American and over 50% female, did this march with the Germantown Friends students. And the reason that I'm sharing this kind of very minor alteration to the landscape is just to share the idea that it can be very community building. And I think right now is a time where people are kind of concerned about our collective future. But within community, we can change the stories that we tell. We can tell the untold stories, and we can learn from and about each other in the process. And I always like to close with this quotation. It's from the young poet Amanda Gorman, who read her poem, The Hill We Climb, at Biden's inauguration. And what she says here is really what I hope is the big takeaway of both my presentation and my book. She said, "Being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it." So with that, I want to really thank you for coming out tonight, because it's just not a beautiful evening. And I didn't know if there'd be anyone here but my husband and the APS staff. So I really appreciate you being here. Thank you. And just before I take questions, those are ways to contact me. I really love doing presentations, so if you're part of or know of other organizations, churches, libraries, even book groups, I'm always happy to talk to folks about the book, so thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for a very interesting presentation. I'm just curious, Is what's happening in Philadelphia with more and more awareness, I guess I'll say, of the Black experience? Is that happening around the country as well? I had lunch with some friends today who were talking to me about how the Tulsa race riots are represented in Tulsa, and it seems to me that at least in a number of places, that's sort of a movement in the country. A couple of weeks ago, we were at the International African American Museum in Charleston, and again, just bringing this message to the forefront. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts because there is a lot of good news. I actually, in the introduction, I talk about having my stepdad's relatives visiting Philadelphia from Tulsa. And I gave them like a Black history tour of Philadelphia. And then I was asking them about the Tulsa massacre from 1921. They were shocked that I had heard of it. But, so that would have been sometime in like the 20-teens. By the time the 100th anniversary came around, it was broadcast live on national television because there had been, in part because of the racial reckoning, if you will, following the police murder of George Floyd, there had been kind of this explosion in interest in Black history, and it was live on, CNN and all kinds of stations. And I was actually in Tulsa this year and got to see the museum and the memorials and everything out there. So on the one hand, yes, that is going on. I hear great things about the museum in Charleston. Quick story, our daughter was down there with her boyfriend a couple weeks ago, and they were going to go to the museum. And it must have been Sunday, January 19th, and they went to the museum. Biden was there. It was his last day in office. She said, how often do you so they had to go back on King Day, but anyway. So there has been all this progress. At least in some parts of the country, I think we know that there is going to be regress. Fort Liberty was just renamed Fort Bragg, for example. Now it's not named for a Confederate general anymore. They somehow, Pete Hegseth found some other, like Sergeant Bragg from the Second World War. I mean, it's great for him. But anyway, so I think there will be retrenchment, but I do think that Philadelphia is doing a very good job. And just one more quick anecdote. A book came out about a year ago, right after mine, called A Black Philadelphia Reader, and I did a joint event with the author of that, who lives in New York. It's an anthology of Black writing in Philadelphia. Anyway, he was saying that he was walking around in Harlem, and a plaque caught his eye, and he realized the plaque was indicating that the building had been like the national headquarters for Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association. And he said he could have easily missed it. And, in Philadelphia, there is a marker by our kind of shabby and not in great shape and needs love UNIA headquarters, but I think Philadelphia has done a pretty good job.
I want to mention one other positive event most recently, and that was the gift from two APS members, Leslie Ann Miller and Rich Worley, to rename the Verizon Hall. But I also have a rather different twist, and that is, are there notable absences that also mark recognition of Blacks in Philadelphia? The one that, I haven't been here very long, but the one that occurs most to me is the removal of Rizzo's statue from the city hall, and I wonder if there are other absences here that are in some sense recognitions of Black history.
Okay. So absences in terms of statues being removed. Not off the top of my head. I mean, there was the big controversy around Columbus. Unless someone in the audience can, I can't think of others. I mean, there was a Rizzo mural that I believe was painted over. But, there's also a Harriet Tubman mural that was painted over. That's one issue with murals, is they tend to be more ephemeral than these other forms, especially in a place like Philly that's developing so quickly. I thought what you were asking was absence of Black history, and I think there's always a subjectivity to who gets recognized. So Caddo, the reason he is recognized in the way that he is that Jim Kenney, when he was a councilman, read about the assassination of Octavius Caddo, and it was done by a man named Fran Kelly, who, like Jim Kenney, was an Irish American, and he thought to himself, why did I never hear of this? We never learned about this when I was at St. Joe's Prep. And so he became very interested in Caddo, and then Dan Biddle and Mary Dubin wrote this book, and so there was kind of this groundswell of interest around Caddo, and then, of course, Jim Kenney becomes Mayor Kenney. One could argue that William Still, the father of the Underground Railroad, was maybe more worthy of a statue. So there's definitely a subjectivity in terms of who's represented and who isn't, but other than the removal of the Rizzo statue, I can't think of any other selective editing.
So just relative to William Still, doesn't have to be an either or. We can have both. Probably should have both.
Yes.
I do have a question though. So before I came to the APS, I was a university instructor, and before that I worked in museum studies and in museum education. And I remember watching that the President's House became a case study, right? Mm-hmm. That we would work through in our classes, sometimes in a good way, because it was how communities work with academics and public historians to help shape the idea behind a site. But sometimes as a warning, because it is, honestly, I felt at one point I could have taken the historians on the committee of the President's House, and pointed to each object in the exhibition that they probably fought for. And so as a result, it comes together as a series of stories rather than, I agree with Inga Saffron, rather than an integrated narrative that flows from subject to subject. So now I've just tipped my hand, and that's not a question. What do you think of it?
I've taken groups there several times, and which has made me like it more and like it less, in the sense that there's kind of something for everyone. There's Ona Judge's Footsteps in the Sidewalk. There's the vitrine where you can see the archaeology. You can watch videos. You can read the placards. So it's a lot. But I think it is a reflection of a more open process where we're not kind of telling a single story, a single narrative. So there's definitely like a hodgepodgey feel to it, but that also kind of makes it more interesting. And speaking to people in the Park Service when I was doing the research for the book, it really was just this seminal moment in interpretation of history, through including the Black experience. But my title of the chapter on the President's House Memorial is P.S. George Washington slept here. So. But there's a lot of places to learn about George Washington. So anyway, so I think it's interesting, and it was a challenge.
I think this will be our last question tonight. It's so people online can hear you.
I think it's for the folks online. Hi, folks online.
The Philadelphia African American Museum is moving, and I was just wondering if you had information or details about that.
I knew that was proposed. I did not know it was signed, sealed, and delivered. So clearly I don't. I know there was talk of moving it to the court building on the Parkway. But in terms of a timeline or the funding, I don't know. It's kind of an anticlimactic question to end on, but this has really been fun. And
So rather than ending on an anticlimactic question, we will end on thanking Amy once again for joining us. I will thank all of you for proving that we are not made of sugar and the threat of rain will not keep us away. And I will encourage you, if you haven't already read Amy's books, we do have copies for sale in the back of the room, and she will be available to sign them.
I will, and if anyone's still out there on online world, if you want to buy it from Temple Press, there's a discount code, Cohen, all caps, 25. So Cohen 25 at the Temple Press website, and you'll be able to get the book for $15.
Okay. Thank you very much.